Hey, folks, welcome to another episode of the Bulwarg Disclosure Podcast. If you've been watching up until this point, you are probably aware that we're mostly a guest focused type of podcast. And today, actually, we're joined by an extremely special guest. He is a journalist and an author of some very important books on the topics of conspiracy, corruption, blackmail, including the shocking story of power brokers, child abuse, and betrayal entitled The Franklin Scandal. We have here today with us Nick Bryant. Nick, thank you for joining us.
Glad to be with you, Noah.
In addition, also to your pretty excellent body of journalistic work, you have kind of the unique honor of being the individual who first obtained and published Jeffrey Epstein's famous Black Book. Can you tell us a little bit about that, Nick?
I did indeed. I had the Franklin scandal was published in about 2010, and it's about an interstate child trafficking network that was covered up. It had an affiliation with intelligence, and also blackmail was involved. And I spent 7 years on that book, and it took a lot out of me. That book was really, really arduous. And I spent 7 years looking for victims and people that had taken part in that network. I had a list of, I was able to get sealed grand jury documentation, and I had a list of like 325 people that had been involved in that network. And the network flew kids from coast to coast, and I even acquired about 200 flight receipts. And the vast majority of the flight receipts went to Washington, D.C., where there was a house that was rented for audiovisual blackmail, and it was owned by a guy named Craig Spence. So that got published in 2010, and I was exhausted. I mean, I was exhausted. And I didn't really want to write about another network. But I saw what was going on in the Epstein case. I was reading articles about it. And at that point, Epstein was just a lone pedophile.
Mhm.
But there was something about that case that reminded me very much of the Franklin scandal. And I went down to Florida. At that point, I was living in New York City. I'm still living in New York City, for better, for worse, and sickness and in health.
Mhm.
Um, and I managed to acquire his Black Book. I got it in 2012, and I came back to New York City. I'd pitched Epstein previously to various magazines, and then I came back with his Black Book, and then I pitched Epstein, and no one wanted to touch it. So I just held on to it. And finally, Gawker was willing to publish it, and we put it up in 2015, and the rest is history. Although I should say that only two publications have even acknowledged me putting up the Black Book, and two major publications. So when they talk about the Black Book, they talk about Gawker. They don't talk
Mhm.
about Nick Bryant.
Mhm.
And given my history with the Franklin scandal, I was pitching the Franklin scandal in 2002, 2003. And it was a horrific story about this huge pedophile network that was covered up, very much a carbon copy of what we see with Epstein. And I was meeting with editors in New York City, and I could see the wheels turning. They thought to themselves, this is a horrible story. I need to help Nick Bryant out. Or I can take door B, which is I'm going to write Nick Bryant off as crazy, and then I can have a nice meal with my family tonight.
Mhm.
So at that point, I had access to a number of editors for major magazines. And by the time I got around to acquiring Epstein's Black Book, I had editors, but they didn't want anything to do with it. And then Gawker published it, and then the floodgates opened.
Mhm. Mhm. I'm not sure if you probably are familiar with it, but there's another list out there, and I think the general consensus is that it is not authentic, but it's basically, I mean, the list pretty much contains any Hollywood or, music industry celebrity that you could think of. But I was just curious if you knew, A, is there any legitimacy to that separate list? And B, where did that even come from?
A, I don't know, and B, I don't know.
Hmm.
I will say this, people are talking about the Epstein list,
Hmm.
and there is no Epstein list.
Hmm.
It's not like it was the Jeffrey Epstein travel agency,
Right.
and you called up ahead of time and booked a flight with him. There isn't an Epstein client list. The closest we've come is the Black Book that I put up in 2012. And also I put up a number of flight logs too. I was the first guy to put up flight logs. Again, a number of media have talked about the flight logs, but they don't really want to talk to me about the flight logs. So with Epstein, what we have is when Epstein was busted in 2019 and his safe was drilled, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of compact discs and also hard drives.
Mhm.
Now, if we want justice in the Epstein case, a lot of it was child pornography, but I think that there were a number of compromise or compromise
Right.
images too. So if we want justice, we need reports on those, on that, what was taken from the contents of the safe. When Epstein killed himself, the Fed said that the case was over. So finished. So I FOIA'd, and I didn't ask for the DVDs. I asked for reports on the DVDs.
Hmm.
And I was told that the case was ongoing. So, and I did it again about 6 months later, and I got the same reply.
Have you ever disclosed where you got the Black Book? Is that something you're able to talk about at all?
Well, one of the attorneys representing a number of the
Okay.
victims gave it to me.
Okay. Just curious, and I know you can't go probably too much into detail there. But I have a question about the Franklin scandal, and it might kind of come off as a strange question.
I
Well,
see that you've actually got the book,
I do,
and,
yes,
and you've actually read the book.
a number of times, and
I'm
that's
hoping. Okay. Well,
well, that's where my question comes
I
from.
like that. I like that. When people that are interviewing read my books,
Actually
it
have
makes it
read your
much
work.
easier.
Yes, I'm sure. I'm sure. But that's actually where my question comes from because before I'd read yours, I had read John DeCamp's version of events, the Franklin cover-up. So my question is, why did you feel like you needed to write a second book about this event when there's, not that yours isn't revelatory and important as well, but there already is kind of this definitive version of it that exists, by John DeCamp, who was a part of the Nebraska state legislature at the time and was pretty much directly involved in the case.
I felt that the Franklin scandal needed journalistic integrity.
Hmm.
If you read DeCamp's book and read my book, you'll see, I believe, and I've been told by a number of sources, that it's a quantum leap
Hmm.
in our understanding of Franklin.
Hmm.
And John DeCamp was affiliated with the LaRouche organization. And they were the ones that did a lot of the research and writing of that book.
Hmm.
So I did not feel that that book had journalistic integrity because with my book, I assiduously corroborated information.
Right.
Like I was able to make the jump from Nebraska to Washington, D.C. with 200 flight logs and also 5 people that went on record that said that
Hmm.
Craig Spence was part of that network. And DeCamp didn't really make that leap. I mean, he talked about Spence, but he could not connect King and Spence together. So, because the Washington side, the Washington, D.C. side of the Franklin scandal is very important.
Yeah.
You have to understand that side of the story. And then all the malfeasance by the FBI and Department of Justice in Nebraska makes sense.
Mhm.
If you do not factor in Washington, D.C., the malfeasance and injustices that were dispensed by federal law enforcement in Nebraska don't make any sense. They're almost like a non sequitur.
Mhm. Sure. Sure. It kind of reminds me of, I know you actually wrote the foreword for the book, but Dave McGowan's Weird Scenes in the Canyon and some of the topics that he, speculates about in that book without very much, sourcing, I guess you would say, as compared to something like Tom O'Neill's Chaos, which more in line with with the Franklin scandal is, sourced to no ends. I mean, it's much more, it has much more legitimacy to it, I guess. And for any of our listeners who aren't familiar with the Franklin scandal, and you should certainly go out and buy Nick's book and read it, but it pretty much centers around this guy, Larry King, who was, I guess, a quickly rising African-American Nebraska state senator who was embroiled in this organized crime syndicate that was operating under the cover of a local credit union. And something that I found really interesting, Nick, in the whole case is that even though, the Nebraska Senate that was investigating it, the committee, they acquired testimony from over 100 children, I think, some as young as 10, corroborating impossible to know details about the case and about this internationally operating trafficking organization. But as far as the media covering of it, it's pretty much gotten swept under the rug of the same, satanic panic milieu that's been used to kind of I mean, there's a whole government organization that was created, the False Memory Center Foundation, whose sole purpose was discrediting victims of childhood sexual abuse. And a lot of people don't know, but the founders of that organization, Pam and Peter Fried, were actually their children accused them of raping them throughout their lives. So what do you make about that?
Let me back up a little bit. There were actually 6 victims that came forward in the Franklin scandal. There were a lot more. I mean, I've got a list of 60 of them. But there were 6 that went on record. And the FBI was very harsh. I think a lot more victims could have come forward if the FBI was actively investigating the case instead of actively covering it up.
Mm-hmm. And you're talking about Paul Benassi and Alicia Owens that actually went to prison for perjury?
Well, Alicia went to prison, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Paul was indicted. There was a girl that had been molested in that network since she was an adolescent, and the FBI came in and really pressured the victims to recant their accounts of abuse. And Alicia wouldn't and Paul wouldn't, and they were both indicted on perjury.
Mm-hmm.
Alicia was looking, and Alicia was a 19-year-old kid at that point. She was looking at 200 years in prison, and Paul was looking at 60 years in prison, and they still refused to recant their accounts of abuse. Whereas the FBI had gotten really heavy with some of the other victims, and they were drug addicts. I mean, and fold like a house of cards. And that's what makes this type of system so perfect is these kids, a lot of them come from very dysfunctional families. And if they perform well, they're given money, they're given drugs. And then at a certain point, they lose their youthful marketability and they're just expunged and from the network. And what you end up with is children, young adults that have been molested repeatedly,
right,
and are drug addicts,
broken humans,
and go on to compromise their own credibility. That happened to a number of the victims that I found in the Franklin scandal. A number of them ended up in prison.
It sounds very similar to how Epstein and the Maxwell operation selected their victims, people from lower socioeconomic classes. And it's just really sick, all of it to think of. And I know that
and Epstein and Dershowitz did the same thing. Is they went after the credibility of the victims.
Right.
And according to the government and the media, the youngest victim of Epstein's was 14, which is very, very horrific. But actually, they were younger than that. There were victims in Epstein's network that were younger than 14 years old. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. As there were victims in the Franklin network that were younger than 14 years old. A major difference between that Franklin network and the Epstein network is that, according to federal law and state law enforcement, not a single child was abused by the Franklin trafficking network. And in the Epstein network, it's been acknowledged by law enforcement that several children were abused.
Mm-hmm. But no clients, right? Children abused and trafficked, but no clients to speak of.
With no clients, yeah.
Right. Jumping back to Larry King, who was at the center of the Franklin scandal. I know you've kind of spoken about keeping tabs on him over the years, which is a great public service in itself. So thank you for that. But I was just curious what the hell he's up to nowadays. Does he go by an alias? Like, how can he even be allowed to live in open society?
Larry is a super predator.
Mm-hmm.
There were two primary pimps that ran that Franklin network. One was Lawrence King. One was Craig Spence. As I said earlier, Craig Spence had a home in Washington, D.C. King was a vacuum for children. And he actually got a lot of children from the August institution, Boys Town, mm-hmm. which is outside of Omaha, Nebraska. Mm-hmm. There were a number of Boys Town kids that were trapped. And I know that this sounds, because Boys Town is looked at as an iconic orphanage, which it is. Mm-hmm. But King, nonetheless, was trafficking a lot of Boys Town students. And then there was a inveterate pedophile named James Kelly, Father James Kelly, who molested God knows how many kids. And I believe that Kelly enabled King to get those kids. I believe that Kelly was compromised. But King never did time for molesting children, even though he molested scores of children and trafficked scores of children. He had embezzled $40 million from a credit union that he managed, and right. That's what he went to prison for. And they put him away for about 10 years. And then he got out, and then he had a no-show job at a BMW dealership waiting for him. He was taken care of. And I think that Maxwell and also P. Diddy had the same talk. Mm-hmm. You've trafficked a lot of children. We've compromised a lot of people. You've done some good work, but you're going to have to go down for a while.
Right.
If not, Craig Spence committed suicide, and whatever happened to Jeffrey Epstein, I mean, he died mysteriously. Mm-hmm. So I think that was the wrap, and King kept his mouth shut as Maxwell kept her mouth shut. And I think that Diddy is going to keep his mouth shut too. Mm-hmm. But King has surfaced 3 times. He tried to inveigle himself in Granville Academy. And I looked into Granville Academy, and it takes children, lower socioeconomic children, on field trips. It's not even a school. And that was very troubling to me. So I got him kicked out of Granville Academy. And then his malignant head surfaced at the Washington Redskins event committee. And I got him kicked out of that, actually pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. And then he surfaced at Opera Nova, which serves a number of functions, but it teaches lower socioeconomic children how to sing. That's one of the things that it does.
So still just trying to ingratiate himself around children, where he'll have access to children.
And I got him kicked out of there too.
Jeez.
And he's living in Reston, Virginia. He should be in prison for the duration, but mm-hmm. and what's really troubling to me about this is there are people in the federal government that know that he's a super predator because they covered it up for him. And it's up to a journalist to protect children from a super predator. How upside down is that?
Right. And perhaps he's still serving some purpose, outside of prison prison cells that they want to keep him there for you. It reminds me of Charles Manson, which also has an interesting connection because he went to Boys Town when he was young. Do you think that's a coincidence, or do you think that there's a pattern?
I don't know what to think of Boys Town.
Hmm.
Father Flanagan, who founded Boys Town, ended up in post-war Germany,
Hmm.
ostensibly to show people how to create orphanages. I don't know what to make of that organization.
Hmm.
It's it's a recipient of millions of dollars,
Wow.
and I don't know where that money goes.
Hmm.
I don't
Hmm.
think that money goes to. I mean, there's too much money. It can't go to the kids.
Yeah, yeah.
It Who knows where that money goes?
It's also backwards, and I just feel if we look back pretty much the entirety of American politics from maybe the Hoover administration onwards, we just see this consistent theme of foreign interference and espionage and blackmail, mostly linked to, organizations like Mossad or Israeli assets, and always using blackmail as their primary method of control. So do you view this phenomenon of like Epstein and P. Diddy and these, modern versions of this is essentially a continuation of the same operations that were going on with Roy Cohn and J. Edgar Hoover and Meyer Lansky in the 30s?
Yeah, I mean, it's not only the Mossad, it's the KGB and CIA.
Of
People
course.
want to think that the CIA is cleaner than like the KGB. But all you have to do is look at the mind control documentation that's been released.
Hmm.
And you can see that the CIA was extremely vicious. And with Operation Paperclip, the CIA imported a number of Nazi war criminals to the United States.
Hmm.
Warner von Braun, who was part of NASA,
Hmm.
was a war criminal. He worked Jews to death. So this is something that's been with us forever, is political blackmail. Alexander Hamilton, he's given an exalted view these days. He was having an affair with a 23-year-old who was married, and her husband was shaking down Alexander Hamilton. And then a muckraking journalist came along, and he he outed Alexander Hamilton for having this affair. And what's really interesting about this is Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson hated each other. And the muckraking journalist thought that he would get a position in Jefferson's administration because what he did to an enemy of Jefferson. And Jefferson wouldn't give him a position. And then he outed Jefferson for having sex with his slave, or one of his slaves, Sally Hemings, which has been proven by DNA. So although there are these hagiographies that have been written about our founding fathers, they were still, they had drives
Hmm.
and they were susceptible to blackmail.
Hmm. Hmm. There's always some institution or individual there willing to take advantage of those drives, for their political gain. But the Project Paperclip and Warner von Braun stuff that you brought up, that's kind of a perfect segue to one of the major things I wanted to talk to you about today, actually, which is I guess you would just call the occult aspect in these scandals involving, intelligence organizations. And I find that they're really often overlooked. I have a great deal of respect for him. He's been a guest on the show too, but Tom O'Neill, in his book Chaos, he pretty much glosses over the entire involvement of, groups like the Process Church and the OTO with Manson and, his acolytes and such. But my question for you, and I want to get into this a little bit more, but really the question is the occult aspect of these operations, is it a cloak for the espionage, or is the espionage and blackmail just a positive side effect of legitimate occult practice that these individuals believe in and put into practice and just happen to, film it and use it as blackmail as well?
I can't really speak. I've looked into Epstein and I've looked into Diddy, and I've not been able to find an occult nexus. I
Hmm.
really looked into Epstein looking for an occult nexus
Hmm.
because I was told that people in the New York fashion industry, a number of them are heavily hooked up with the occult. So that was one of the areas that I was looking, and I could never corroborate it.
Hmm.
There is that temple on his former island
Right.
that is kind of inexplicable, but and some people, and then it had an owl, and some people think it was Moloch.
Minerva. Or Minerva, I think, is the owl. Moloch's the bull, right?
Moloch is the god that you sacrifice children to.
Right, right.
So there's some indications there, but it's not solid enough for me. Now, there was
Mhm.
an occult aspect of the Franklin scandal.
Of course.
And I believe that these guys, I mean, these guys are really twisted, really twisted. And with Christianity, the highest sacrament, or one of the highest sacraments, is the preservation of innocence. With these guys, one of their sacraments, if not their highest sacrament, is the destruction of innocence.
Hmm.
And I believe that that was at play in the Franklin scandal. I believe that there were pedophiles that weren't part of the occult, that were just twisted and enjoyed molesting children. But then I also
Hmm.
believe that there was this other side of it where the occultists, and I believe that King was definitely an occultist, where they were their highest, one of their highest sacraments was the destruction of
Hmm.
innocence.
Hmm. I tend to believe it's a little bit of both, right? Like, so the occult stuff kind of serves as a veneer of unbelievability to these things. You can remember when WikiLeaks and things were coming out about Clintons and Podestas and stuff. That's the same time they started, pushing this QAnon and adrenochrome type of stuff, which I think ultimately was to discredit from the legitimate, the real things that were happening with blackmail and pedophilia. But with regards to Epstein, I agree that there's kind of a lack of an occult side of things. The two main things I would point to is Maria Farmer's testimony, who was one of his victims, her and her younger sister, and she talked about ritualistic and occult themes being discussed, and symbols and things that she would see used frequently. But even bigger than that, actually, is something I've stumbled across, and I haven't seen many. I don't know if I've seen anyone really talking about this, but not sure how familiar you are with the story of Jack Parsons and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the NASA precursor.
I'm very
Um,
familiar with Jack Parsons.
well, it
There's
turns out,
actually a crater on the moon that's named after him.
indeed, on the dark side of the moon, of course. But there's a direct connection, I think, to the Maxwell crime family from with Parsons, being that Jack Parsons' right-hand man at Jet Propulsion Laboratory was a guy named Frank Molina. And Frank was involved in a lot of the same occult activities that Jack Parsons was. Obviously he had tutelage by Aleister Crowley, but Frank Molina's son, Roger Molina, today is married to the sister of Ghislaine Maxwell, Christine Maxwell. What do you make of that?
Now
It seems
that's
like
an
too big of a coincidence.
that's an interesting connection. I hadn't heard of that, but it
Mhm.
sounds fascinating.
It's true, and one of their children, I won't name her name just to avoid, I'm not trying to make any unfounded accusations, but one of their children is Harvard educated physician, and I was looking at her tweets at one point, and a few years ago, she was tweeting about, because of COVID, how urgent it is that the medical community advocates for safeguards to be put in place for unaccompanied minors immigrating into the United States. So it sounds like the apples have not fallen far from the tree. Of course, not making any accusations again, but I think that coincidence of Molina and Maxwell families being intermarried at this point is much too, significant to be brushed off as a coincidence.
Well, Jack Parsons took in L. Ron Hubbard.
Right.
L. Ron Hubbard was he was an intelligence officer in World War II, and from what I've been able to gather, he kind of cracked up. And Jack Parsons, who was in the OTO, Aleister Crowley's occult organization.
Right.
Took him in. And actually, he wrote a letter to Crowley saying that L. Ron Hubbard was the most occult gifted individual he'd ever met.
The most thelemic individual, I think he says.
So what happened is L. Ron Hubbard stole Parsons' wife and money from him. And then Parsons, who was a true genius when it came to chemical engineering, blew himself up. And that has always been a fascinating story for me. And then as you know, the Process Church ultimately came out of Scientology.
Correct.
And the Process Church has been linked to not only the Son of Sam murders, but also Charles Manson. I think that's what you're referring to.
Yes, it is. And I mean, Scientology itself was almost an offshoot of the OTO or the Golden Dawn. I mean, the degrees of Scientology pretty much exactly mirror the degrees and rituals in the OTO. And some of them are extreme. You know, there's a guy, L. Ron Hubbard's first son, Ron DeWolf, has talked about in numerous interviews, but I could quote from one from Penthouse in like 1983, talking about his father being obsessed with abortions. And if you know anything about the degrees of the OTO, one of the higher degrees involves something called creating a moon child, which is essentially creating a human baby that has no soul, just to be used as a vessel for magical purposes. And L. Ron Hubbard's son has talked multiple times about seeing his dad performing ritualistic at-home abortions on his mom numerous times, and that it was something that was, you know, a memory in his childhood as far back as he could remember. And he also says that Scientology, the Sea Org, which was this very mysterious, you know, part of Scientology, he said that famous actors like Errol Flynn were personally involved with his father in drug trafficking and specifically, he says, the rape of underage girls. So again, this is almost mirrors things like the Epstein and Maxwell, you know, Terramar project that Ghislaine Maxwell was involved with. That sounds exactly to me like something like Sea Org.
Well, I do know that Errol Flynn went to court he was charged with molesting a minor.
Mm-hmm.
Um, he was ultimately found not guilty.
Mm-hmm.
But what we're talking about is about child trafficking. It's been going on forever. I mean, pedophiles have been with us for a very, very long time. The Roman Emperor Tiberius was said to have enjoyed molesting boys and then throwing them off a cliff. There are accounts of that. Some historians argue against that. Some don't. But what we have now is these networks that are fully operational, that are substantial, and causing tremendous damage, not only to our society, but to the politicians that who are compromised. I had a U.S. congressman named Tim Burchett on my podcast, and he talked about his fellow congressmen and congresswomen being compromised in honey traps. Honey traps have been around forever. And I think that because technology today makes it so easy to compromise someone, I think it's easier to compromise someone today than it's ever been.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the technological age. Yeah, I would agree. I just continue to be fascinated by this overlap of occult societies and you know, intelligence circles, and even jumping back real quick to Jack Parsons, you know, his wife, this Marjorie Cameron figure, she was you know, she was military. She was a cartographer for the Joint Chief of Staff in the 40s, and then went on to be a photographer for propaganda films. I've read that she personally knew Winston Churchill. Her relationships and connections are so abundant. It would take a whole nother podcast to talk about, but she has personal friendships with people like the Getty family, Aldous Huxley, Gerald Hurd, Henry Luce, all these types of people, even people like Genesis Peorage, who was this transgressive performance artist from the 70s and 80s, very famous, a very early and famous transgender man became a woman, who herself or himself or whatever was involved in child abuse scandals in Britain and had to flee the country because of those things and their affiliation with the Process Church. So I don't know. It's just for me, I think it's really fascinating to try to figure out where, these occult secret societies end and where the intelligence organizations begin, or if there is, or if that overlap is, if there isn't, if they're one and the same. You know what I mean?
I mean, we've seen John Dee,
Hmm.
who was very active in the occultist in the 1500s. I
Right.
mean, he was an intelligence agent.
Hmm.
Aleister Crowley was an intelligence
Hmm.
agent. And then Michael Aquino,
Hmm.
also an intelligence agent who was a Satanist.
Hmm.
So you see that what's most important to me on all these issues is that these criminals that are molesting children be brought to justice. I think that there's a dark, malignant corner of the government that has perfected this, that compromises politicians, compromises people of
Hmm.
power. And until we correct this, our society is going to be heavily compromised,
Hmm.
the politicians in our
Hmm.
society.
Hmm.
And I think that today we're seeing the problems that occur when politicians are heavily compromised.
Hmm. Well, then policy itself is compromised, and thereby the public is affected by this things, So a lot of people act like, oh, Epstein was just this, he diddled kids and maybe had some ties to intelligence circles. What does that matter? How does that affect me? But at the end of the day, I really think that these machinations are the direct thing that's led our country to be in the place that it is, you know. Just also like the Dutroux affair, which is a very similar trafficking scandal that happened in Britain, I believe. And at the time,
Actually, it
there
happened
were
in Belgium.
Belgium. Okay, thank you. Yeah, but regardless, at the time, there were historically sized protests that occurred in the streets. People were outraged and demanded that something like that, these people face justice. But that is just not here today. And in my opinion, that is because of the success of programs like MK Ultra and the introduction of the different aspects of society and culture that were strategically placed to, divert anti-war movements and dissident movements in the United States, whether by getting them stoned out on LSD at a Grateful Dead concert so they have no ability to, organize and foment legitimate dissent against the government, or any number of branches of the MK Ultra octopus. But I really think that if that program hadn't been so successful, people would not have set back and allowed what has happened to happen without at least trying to push back. You know what I mean?
Well, people are alienated
Hmm.
and they don't think that they can do anything. But I started an organization called Epstein Justice.
Hmm.
And your audience can go to epsteinjustice.com. They can sign a petition. We've got a form letter that goes to their Congress people. And we're putting together Epstein Justice town hall forums. And we're getting traction. We're starting to grow, but we're giving people. A lot of people know that the government covered up Jeffrey Epstein's child trafficking.
Right.
A lot of people, thousands, know that,
Hmm.
but they feel like they don't have any way to go. And the mainstream media no one in the mainstream media has called for any kind of justice for these kids. And Epstein trafficked kids for about 25 years.
Hmm. It would no doubt implicate a lot of those people in the media, I would say.
So the media isn't doing its job. And because of that, there's no one's sounding off about this issue. But I'm trying to with Epstein justice.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to fix this. You've got the Franklin scandal, you've got Epstein, you've got Fox Island. There were the keepers, and I believe that was up and down the East Coast.
Mm-hmm.
There's a number of these protected pedophile networks, and we have to take care of that if our society is going to flourish, get healthy again.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's just never any, accountability. Like another name you mentioned recently, Michael Aquino. He lived out his life until, he decided to kill himself a couple years ago. And this is somebody who was involved in probably some of the most heinous, possible crimes that a person could be involved in. And it was all at the, at the behest of the CIA, of our own government. Which also, Aquino, if you don't mind changing lanes just really quick, Aquino reminded me of somebody else I wanted to talk to you about, which is Rusty Nelson, who was a blackmail photographer that you knew and interviewed and used as a source in your book, The Franklin Scandal. I know you've talked about Rusty Nelson kind of ad nauseum in other interviews, but my question about him is actually involving another very intriguing character from this time, which was Hunter Thompson, the famous journalist. And in a lot of the allegations in the Franklin cover-up, the original book, from victims, and also Rusty Nelson himself, it sounds like Hunter Thompson was, or at least someone named Hunter Thompson was involved in some of this blackmail procurement. Rusty Nelson says that in 1988, Hunter Thompson offered him $100,000 to film a child sex snuff film.
Let me chime in on that.
Yeah, I just want to know what you think. If you actually think it's him or...
There were two victims. Well, actually, there was one victim that talked about Hunter Thompson, Paul Benassi, and he didn't even know who Hunter Thompson was. I talked to him, and he just said that the guy said his name was Hunter Thompson.
Use that name.
And if you're going to make a snuff film, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to use your real name. With Rusty Nelson, that's a completely different equation. Rusty was busted for child pornography, and he did time. And then he got out, and then he found a woman that he fell in love with, and she financed a photography studio for him. And I'd spent a lot of time with him, and he was, I think at that point, very honest with me, as honest as he could possibly be. I don't go anywhere in the Franklin scandal with Rusty's name alone. I always have to have corroboration. But when he put together that photography studio, the Nebraska State Patrol raided it, like within a day or two, and impounded everything. And he had shut down. He had to shut down his business, and then he started, and he was kind of reticent about talking to podcasters, but then he started granting interviews to all kinds of podcasters and talking about Hunter Thompson and all kinds of other stuff. And I think it was 5 or 6 pictures in front of Rusty Nelson of writers. I even made it that simple for him, of writers. And I said, pick out Hunter Thompson, and he could not. So I think that we can safely say that Rusty Nelson was not telling the truth in that case.
Yeah, and I do agree that there is not much in the way of corroboration for that. I do, though, think that there are some very strange coincidences, maybe you could say, that lean me towards maybe not being so convinced that it wasn't that Hunter Thompson. E. Jean Carroll, who was, the author who now famously was embroiled in this lawsuit with Donald Trump. But E. Jean Carroll lived with Hunter Thompson for a while in the 90s and wrote a book about it. And there's a passage in that book where she's talking about some of just his antics, and she mentions that he would make her watch snuff films of people being killed on camera, in between shoving his cat's nose in cocaine and laughing while it darted around the room. So you have that. You also have Nicole Brown, who was a poet and a friend of his, who said that at one point Hunter threw her out of the house because she refused to watch snuff movies. And then if you look at some of Hunter's writings, his own books, one of them called Hey Rube, there's a paragraph that he talks about. I'll just quote real quick. He says the autumn months are never calm time in America, a traditional period, a time of strong rituals and celebrating of strange annual holidays like Halloween and Satanism and the fateful harvest moon, which can have ominous implications for some people. There's always a rash of kidnappings and abduction of school children in the football months. Preteens of both sexes are traditionally seized and grabbed off the streets by gangs of organized perverts who traditionally give them as Christmas gifts to each other to be used as personal sex slaves and playthings. And I apologize, I couldn't do a good Hunter Thompson accent there, but I just find it very strange. There's probably not too much to go into more with it, but I just was interested in your take.
As I said, I showed Rusty photographs of writers,
Hmm.
and I made it very easy on him. They were just writers, and he couldn't pick Hunter Thompson out.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I don't know what to make of that. I don't think Rusty was telling the truth, but these other things about Hunter Thompson,
Hmm.
I don't know what to make of them.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, well, we'll leave it at that. I don't really I don't disagree with you. Um, Another quick question on that topic. Do you think that Jeff Gannon is actually Johnny Gosch?
No, and I talk about that in the Franklin scandal. I met Jeff Gannon, and he's too old to be Johnny Gosch.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I believe he's too short to be Johnny Gosch. So I that kind of bothers me. I mean, that is still going on. That
Hmm.
rumor is still going on because I really do debunk it in the
I
Franklin
I think
scandal.
his mom, I think Maureen Gosh is really the main person that still pushes that theory as far as I know. But I agree, it never seemed like it had many the legs to stand on. I want to be respectful of your time because we're getting close to an hour here, Nick. But I wanted to ask you a question because you wrote the foreword to one of my favorite books of all time, which is Weird Scenes in the Canyon by Dave McGowan. Did you know Dave well before he died?
Dave and I were friends. Yeah.
Hmm.
I
What
mean,
let
I'm not saying that Dave and I agreed on a lot of stuff,
sure.
but we were friends.
Hmm. Hmm. What
And
led to you writing that
he was a good
foreword for
guy.
him?
He asked me to write the foreword for Weird Scenes,
Hmm.
and I read the book and I liked it. When we were talking about Weird Scenes in Tom O'Neill's book,
Yeah.
and then the Franklin cover up, and then the Franklin scandal, I think that Tom O'Neill, what he did with that information was really corroborated, much more than Dave corroborated it.
Yeah.
Dave had some very interesting stuff in that book,
Hmm.
but I wasn't really convinced of his thesis that the hippie movement was basically a fishbowl,
Hmm.
and that it was, and at some point it was going to be neutralized. I think Tom O'Neill makes a very good case that Manson had intelligence connections and that there was foreknowledge of what Manson was going to do the night that he killed all those
Hmm.
Sharon Tate and her friends.
Hmm.
I think that O'Neill, what he's put together is very, very solid.
Right. Yeah, I think that there are a lot of names and individuals we would probably never have any idea existed if it weren't for Tom's research. For some reason, I'm blanking on the name, but do you remember the name of the guy from the book who was an undercover? I think he worked for the FBI maybe or something, but he would go undercover as a hippie, and he eventually said to one of his daughters, like on his deathbed, that he was at the Tate House the morning after the murders happened, and his one biggest regret in life was that he could have maybe stopped it and wasn't able to. Do you remember who I'm talking about?
I know who you're talking about, but like you, my memory is fading.
Actually, it just came to me. Reeve Whitson. That was it. Reeve
Okay.
Whitson.
Yes.
Reeve Whitson. But yeah, like a person
But
like
there
that,
was
we would have
also
never known about.
O'Neill had a lot of information there,
Yeah.
not just Whitson, but there was other things that corroborated it. That was a very impressive book. Unfortunately, to write a book like that or to write a book like the Franklin scandal, you've just got to throw yourself into it. And the Franklin scandal was 7 years for me, and I think it was like 9 years for Tom O'Neill, or
Mhm.
19 years for Tom
Yeah.
O'Neill. So,
Yeah.
but I think both books are solid in demonstrating that the government narrative is a lie.
I agree. I agree. Real quick, because of such an overlap in topics with this book and yours, what do you think about Dave McGowan's Program to Kill, if you've read it?
I think that is by far his best book.
Hmm.
I like Program to Kill, and I think that he's got a lot of very, very good information in Program to Kill. Could have used a little editorial, but I think that the scholarship in Program to Kill is pretty remarkable.
I agree. And so many of the themes and patterns and events and everything in it are almost like precognitive of what was to come in the years after he released. I wish he was still around to hear his take on something like Epstein, just because of how close it is to much of the material in Program to Kill, which if we're to believe his thesis, basically, essentially means that almost all of the American serial killers were mind control victims and used as cover for other or used as kind of patsies for other murders and killings and high profile things of that nature. So it's a wild book.
I wouldn't say all of them, but I would say a segment of them. And he
Mhm.
also brought in the Phoenix program too.
Right. Right.
The Phoenix program was there were North Vietnamese that were going into South Vietnamese villages and proselytizing communism.
Hmm.
And our CIA, in its infinite wisdom, felt that we had to kill them. And we killed 20 to 30,000 that the government acknowledges innocent people for during the Phoenix program. And Dave makes a link to some serial killers and the Phoenix program too. And
Yeah.
I could see how that could happen. About a year and a half ago, I buried my uncle who lives in LA. And
Sorry to hear that.
he had he shouldered a lot of guilt. And we were pretty close. And he told me that he reached a point where he enjoyed killing people. And I said, Al, that's a normal reaction to a very abnormal situation. They're they're trying to kill you. They're trying to kill your friends, and they're killing your friends. I think it's just human nature that there would be some satisfaction in killing the people that are trying to kill you and kill your friends.
Hmm.
But his guilt or shame, I was never able to assuage it, regardless of what I said. And then I went to bury him, and I saw a painting of his, and it was a GI standing over dead babies. And then, because the CIA was the spearhead of the Phoenix program, but there were a number of people in the Army that were conscripted to take part in it.
Hmm.
And then at that point, when I saw that painting, I realized what had happened to my uncle and why he had guilt that he couldn't shake.
So you think he was possibly involved in Phoenix operations?
I do. Yes.
Wow.
I do.
That would be a lot to bear. I can't imagine that.
He came back and he became a chiropractor, and he did well, but then at some point the wheels just came off for him.
Mhm.
And he hit the vodka from morning till night. And very sad, very sad.
Yeah. Was he your only relative that was military?
No, I had another uncle that was sent over there, and it affected him too. It didn't affect him the way it affected my other uncle, because obviously my other uncle had, I think, taken part in some pretty horrific operations.
Mm-hmm.
But both of them came back very disillusioned about what we were doing in Vietnam.
Yeah. Yeah. Can't imagine not. Well, we're getting pretty close here to an hour, Nick. So I want to be respectful of your time. One quick last question before I let you go. Do you
Not a
think
problem.
do you think that we will get anything in the way of truth or disclosure when it comes to Kash Patel and all these, rumblings in the Trump administration that they're going to release some type of documents about JFK and 9/11?
We will see. I mean, supposedly they're going to release the Epstein list, which I said probably doesn't exist. It's
Mm-hmm.
not like
Mm-hmm.
there was a Jeffrey Epstein travel agency. I'm writing an article about it right now. And we don't need a list. We know who the perps are. We know who a lot of the perps are. We know the women that were pimping out these young girls.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't need a list to prosecute. What we need is we need to round up. The New York Times actually in 2019 had an article, and it named 6 Epstein procurers.
Mm-hmm.
Maxwell was one of them, and Kellen and Marcinkova and Groff. And what we need is for the federal government to do a RICO case. And what they did with the mafia is they get a bunch of small fry crooks and then hit them with multiple RICO predicates where they would be looking at life in prison, and then they would turn over on the big fish.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we could do right now with Epstein.
Mm-hmm.
We could indict those procurers. Trafficking, child trafficking has a heavy sentence in the federal justice system. It's 15 years to life. So if we indicted those women on multiple counts of child trafficking, they would roll over. We don't need the list. I don't even think the list exists.
Mm-hmm.
What we need is prosecutions. And I urge your audience to check out EpsteinJustice.com.
Absolutely. Is there anything else that we can do to be a part of that, bigger than just signing a petition?
You can send us an email. And if you want to take part, we can figure out where we can push it.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, Nick, I've really enjoyed talking today, and hopefully we can maybe do it again sometime in the future. But thank you so much for coming on.
Absolutely. Have a great day.
You too. Thanks, Nick. Bye-bye.